Hello and welcome to the fourth edition of the Signal Horizon podcast. And it is with great pleasure that I can introduce you to Mary Kissel, who I have been following, unbeknownst to her, since her times at the Wall Street Journal, where I was an avid listener to the foreign edition podcast she did together with Brad Stevens. And I'm twice as excited to talk to her today, because I got lots of messages recently from my friends in the United States who asked me, so what's going on in Europe? European elections, European Parliament, what's going on there? What is this? So I kind of want to turn this around, and Mary would like to ask you, what's currently going on in the United States? As always, you know, since the days of George W. Bush, we Europeans always tend to think that the Americans have gone entirely crazy, and it only got worse since the 2000s. Can you enlighten us a little bit and maybe tell us why we are wrong and why the United States, in fact, are not crazy at all?
Well, it's great to be with you, Ralph, and I'm an admirer of yours and your podcast, so the feeling is very mutual, and I'm honored to join you today. I think just as it's very difficult to generically talk about Europe writ large, it's very difficult to ask that question of the United States because we're a republic of 50 states. They're very different. Living and working in Texas, where I am now, is distinctly different from California. But I think if you do want to generalize, you can say a few things. First of all, the United States is a country of very robust institutions, and I think this often gets lost in a lot of the European coverage because, let's face it, if you have negative headlines, it pulls viewership and clicks. But you know, all of the core institutions that we rely on, our rule of law, our property rights, our democratic institutions, our elections, they don't function perfectly, but they function better than most every other country. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say on the negative side is that what is going on, at least from an economic point of view, is very similar to what's happening on the continent and in the UK. Namely, we have a surge of illegal immigration, which is creating an enormous strain on our public sector institutions, be it schools or hospitals, et cetera. We have rising crime in urban centers. We have a renewed threat from terrorism. We have quite sticky inflation. We have subdued economic growth. We have a real despair that the American dream is not something that generations to come will enjoy. And so that is driving a lot of the discussion here in the United States when it comes to the elections, which we're approaching, of course, in November.
When we look at exactly what you just described, I think what is very often overlooked, particularly in Europe, but I would say in other places in the world as well, is that structurally the United States seem to be still very strong, right? You're basically floating on a sea of hydrocarbons. You would be, if you would want to, you would be energy independent, or if you would get rid of certain environmental regulations at least. Very robust institutions. It's still the number one destination for most of the talent in the world. So there's a lot going on that one would say, okay, under these conditions, the American century is not coming to an end. It might just be beginning. So as an American, as somebody who works in the United States, you just mentioned you're in Texas, you lived in New York, you've been to Washington, so you have a good overview over the entirety of the United States. What do you think is it that there seems to be some kind of, maybe not negative, but pessimism? There's I know we had this in the 70s with Japan as well, you know, the rising sun will take over the United States, but there's always this, I think a little bit of it is jealousy and envy in Europe, but there's always this sense of now America is declining. It's the end of the American moment, and this will be their downfall. What do you think also in the United States, if you look at certain commentators, there's almost a certain kind of a masochistic glee in kind of announcing the end of the United States as the unipolar power, a superpower. What do you think from your personal kind of just as your gut feeling, what do you think very often drives this pessimism?
Well, I think the media drives a lot of the pessimism, to be honest. I also think that you see, as you rightly imply, very different conditions across the different states. I mean, we have seen a huge exodus of people and capital out of the blue states, the Democrat-led states, into red states like Texas, Florida, Tennessee. And the difference is really striking, Ralph. I mean, when you walk around the streets of New York, it doesn't matter what time of day it is or which neighborhood you're in. You see attacks, random attacks on the street, knifings, people being pushed on subway trains, and we're not talking about quote unquote, crime-ridden areas. We're talking about the nicest neighborhoods in New York where crime has historically been very low. I mean, you compare that to, walking around the streets of Miami, which is becoming a new Wall Street. And oh, by the way, speaking of which, we've just had an announcement that we're starting a Texas stock exchange to compete with the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. And you can very clearly see, where the good feeling is, where the negative feelings are. That being said, inflation is paramount. It's everywhere. And it affects us even in states that are well managed and attracting people and capital. And so what will be interesting about these upcoming elections is, number one, who is motivated to vote, who is disenchanted with the current administration, and that changes with every election. Remember that the coalitions that we saw, for instance, I'll just speak of the conservative side, which is the side I know best. You can think about George W. Bush, who motivated Christian conservatives to come out and vote, or compare that to President Trump, who I served under, who motivated and captured blue-collar labor workers. Well, who's going to be motivated now? We have a very unpredictable election coming up. Republicans, and President Trump in particular, clear leads in terms of economic stewardship. Some 80% of Americans think he'd do a better job. Same with immigration. But it's really not a nationwide election. It's an election in a few swing states. And so there are states now in play, such as, say, Minnesota, such as, say, Virginia. President Trump is even campaigning in New York, which hasn't been won by a Republican in a very long time. And I think the reason he's doing that is because this, not just economic condition that we're facing in the United States, as you said earlier, hasn't been seen since the 70s, but the level of urban crime and the disorder in the world are creating anxieties among the voting public that might produce an outcome that no one is anticipating.
Do you think, which you just described, could this be a symptom of a new alignment, as it hasn't happened that often in American history? I looked at a couple of recent polls. I think during the last presidential election, Joe Biden won 88% of the African-American vote. Now, apparently, he's down to 69%. Doesn't mean that kind of the remaining 31% will all go to Donald Trump, but apparently there's a growing number of members of the African-American community who would at least entertain the idea to vote for Donald Trump, and even among young people. He's not kind of the kind of a boogeyman that he was in the past. Do you think that there is something shifting, particularly also among the Hispanic population? Trump seems to get more popular, and he is currently most likely the candidate for the Republican Party. So we have to take a closer look at him. Do you think that there is really something shifting underneath the surface that both the media and kind of the commentariat class has not yet fully realized?
Yes, but again, it depends on where those shifts occur. Because President Trump, if he's not jailed, which I hope to goodness that the New York courts do not do. I thought the case that was brought against him in New York State court was absurd, and polls show that it didn't change at all the American voter view of President Trump or President Biden. I think largely because it was such a ridiculous case, but we can talk about that later. Your question is a very good one. Will black voters, Hispanics, even Asian Americans move more toward the Republican side in the swing states that matter? For instance, Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, urban centers, Detroit, Michigan. These are the places where we really need to watch closely, because again, it's not really a national contest. It's a state by state contest. And there are only a few states that will likely determine the outcome, unless the disaffection with all of those problems that I mentioned earlier manifest themselves in a much greater way, in which case you'd see a Reagan-like outcome. You'd see an outcome like you just saw with the European elections in France, where Marine Le Pen's party, basically, had a massive success. We could see that too. But again, there are just so many factors that we don't know yet, Ralph. We don't know, number one, who's motivated to vote. Number two, we don't know what's going to happen in these court cases against Trump, many of which, or actually all of which I think are spurious. And three, We don't know how much the vice presidential pick is going to matter, given the age of the candidates, and I might even add a fourth, which is, the external environment, which almost never plays a role in U.S. domestic elections. But when you see the erosion of U.S. deterrence to the degree that we see today, and Americans see it. I mean, we saw a Chinese balloon float over half of our continent. Then it does stick in the mind, and I think that could be a role too. So, in other words, it's early days, Ralph. Lots of variables, and we haven't even had a debate.
Would it kind of, to your last point, would it be fair to say that even though maybe a majority of voters in the United States don't care that much during a presidential election about foreign policy, they very much do care whether or not they are perceived as being, let's say, losers or winners, or being a laughingstock, or being taken seriously?
I think it's deeper than that, Ralph. I think American voters are often characterized as rubes who don't have passports and don't know that much of the world. And my experience is that that's just nonsense. Even small to medium-sized businesses in the United States, be they, farmers in Iowa who are selling, chicken feet to China, or small electronics manufacturers in Michigan who, have to care about sourcing their materials from, places around the world, or, people who are doing high-end design work remotely, who are selling to clients in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. I mean, we're very, very linked to the rest of the world. We're about a quarter of the global economy. And I think it's less that we care if we're liked or disliked, or anything like that, and more a sense of, real fear about our national security. Take the border, for instance. I think, if you talk to an average American, they'll give you very nuanced answers about hot button issues, be it race or immigration, et cetera. But they want things to be fair, and they don't perceive it as fair or secure to just have millions of people walking across the southern border. And every night, even on politically left-leaning national news media, you're seeing reports of crime and people apprehended who were on the terror watch list. And that is deeply unsettling, and rightly so, not just to Americans who live in border states, but to Americans who, say, live in New York, where we've had several. In fact, I was once told by a New York City police commissioner that they foil 1 to 2 9/11 style attacks a year in New York. And that was 10 years ago. So imagine what's happening now. So it's not just a concern to California, Arizona, Texas, Florida. It's a concern across the country.
I really want to return to this, but there's one question that came to my mind, and I don't want to forget it, so I kind of intersect it real quickly here. I'm very confused at the moment. Depending on which kind of US media I consume, I either hear that the economy is doing really, really bad, or that the economy is doing really, really well and the people just don't realize it. So since you travel a lot, you know the United States inside out, both to your professional and personal life. What is your take on it? So if I would ask you straight out, so how is the US economy doing? Or let me rephrase this question. For whom is the economy working, and for whom isn't the economy working? What would be your answer to that question?
Well, I think it's always important to set the politics aside and look at the data. I'm the vice chairman of a New York Stock Exchange listed transportation solutions company. We're one of the largest full truckload carriers in America. We're really big. And we have been in a freight recession, that's with an R, for 2 years, where we haven't seen capacity exiting the market post-COVID, and we haven't seen the demand on the customer side. And so that means that we have no pricing power, and neither do our competitors. Now, we're doing better than other guys are, because I think we are better, but it is a recession. From that point of view, in that industry. When you look at our economic growth rates, sure, they're better than Europe, but man, that's a low bar, no offense. And the United States has the capacity to grow, 3, 4, 5% with pro-growth policies. And you saw that very clearly. All you have to do is look at the data of the Trump years versus the last 3 years under Biden. It's very clear. Now, you asked, who's doing well in this economy? Well, I think shareholders are doing well. We've had a historic run-up in the stock market. So if you own, equity assets, you might feel okay, but then you go to the grocery store and your eggs cost twice as much as they did last year, or you go to buy a pack of, I don't know, oranges, and you're getting, half the number for, 30% more cost. And that's been going on now for years. And it is really taking a toll on inflation-adjusted wages, which aren't rising in the United States. So, again, if you're holding stocks, you might feel good, but even so, your income isn't going up in inflation-adjusted terms, and your gas prices aren't going down, so you don't feel great. And I think that's why the Biden administration's messaging that, hey, the economy's great, you just don't know it, isn't resonating. And it's why Republicans are leading by such a wide margin when you're asked who's a better steward of the economy, because the personal experience of the everyday American is not what Democrats say that it is. I think they'd be much better off admitting, hey, the Inflation Reduction Act pumped a lot of money into the U.S. economy that we can't afford. It stoked inflation. We've got to roll that back. If they did a Bill Clinton, I think they'd have a much better chance at re-election in the fall. But I doubt they're going to do that.
Do you think that this, what you just described, also is increasing the chances for Donald Trump's re-election? I mean, if we go back to the 2020s, you had COVID, and the election was more or less a referendum on Trump. It was the crazy Trump years, and the way COVID was handled, and everybody was exhausted. And then you had kind of Joe Biden parachute in, although I think it was like the fourth time he was trying to run, or the fifth time, or I think it was not yet in the double digits, but it was not his first attempt at the job. And he promised elderly gentleman, supposedly a deal maker, a broker. He can reach out across the aisle, and he's calm, and he will kind of bring back normalcy to the United States. And this time it looks more that this might actually be a referendum on Joe Biden and not Donald Trump, because everybody knows Donald Trump. He was the president for 4 years, and he hasn't changed much. So do you think that this is potentially what everyone thinks about the two candidates, but that when people go to the voting booth, it's not so much that they say, oh, that's Trump guy, that this time it's more that they say, oh, it's that Biden guy. And then they say, okay, was I happy with the last 4 years, or wasn't I happy with the last 4 years?
Well, both candidates are running personality campaigns. So the Republicans are arguing that Joe Biden is infirm, incapable, physically incapable of carrying out the duties of the presidency. Whereas on the other hand, the Democrats want to make Trump out to be a threat to democracy, and so they want to, tie January 6th to him. And they want to say, when he comes back in, he's just going to be a tyrant and destroy democracy. It's really not about policy to a large degree, although I think Trump is starting to make some policy, declarations. For instance, he's talked about what he would do vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. He started to talk about at the margins about a pro-growth agenda in the United States. I think that's good. I think he could do a lot more of it. But it is unclear to me, Ralph, as you say, if Democrats can really change the view of Trump, given how long he's been in the public eye. One of the reasons I think Joe Biden won that election, besides the fact that Democrats used, the means available to them to get their vote out, meaning mail-in ballots and ballot harvesting and other techniques that Republicans shunned, which they're now embracing, which I think is good. It's also because Biden didn't really campaign. He sat in his basement. Americans couldn't see how the condition of his health and his mental acuity, whereas now they can. So I think all the signs are pointing to this as being a race that is Trump's to lose. The subsidiary question, and also a very important question, is which way is the Senate going to go? Because the Senate, of course, approves presidential nominations and is an extremely important body to advance the president's agenda. So, it's one thing if Trump wins and Republicans win both houses of Congress. It's a different situation altogether if the American public decides to split their vote and have Democrats maintain control of the Senate but give the White House to Republicans. That's a very different situation, and it would really curb, I think, a lot of the policy aspirations that President Trump may have.
Do you think it's, and now I allow myself to sound a little bit like the snarky European that I am, that sometimes outsiders are worried about the United States? If you think you have a somebody who, even by the best intentions, seems as having passed the apex of his physical fitness. I think it's, if you look to interviews of Joe Biden, I mean, he simply was a different person even 5-6 years ago, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. Age is something nobody of us can escape, and it affects us all differently. So this is not his fault. He's not doing it on purpose. And then of course you have Donald Trump, who is, Donald Trump. I mean, he has been around since the first Home Alone with Macaulay Culkin came out. So, he's a known figure. So that's an interesting choice for the still the world's most powerful country. And sometimes you mentioned the Senate. I'm saying this a little bit facetiously, but I'm not entirely unserious about it. Sometimes it feels as one of the kind of the most straightforward, reliable senators is John Fetterman, who is a man who had a series of strokes, and I think to this very day has never worn, maybe 3 or 4 times a suit in his life. So it's sometimes, if you observe the U.S. Congress from the outside and the presidential campaign, it's an interesting combination of the world's most dynamic economy, the world's most powerful country, but then sometimes you have the impression, I'm not saying it's true, but you have then the impression that the politics has an almost, surreal, clownesque quality to it. I think that recently, I'm sure that many of your listeners and viewers know this, I have to play it later on after this video, there was this exchange between 2 congresswomen about one having fake eyelashes and the other one having used too much artificial tanning cream, I think it was. So it's sometimes it's again, do you feel that once again the absurd, the America is so strong that and the institutions are actually so stable that it can afford the occasional absurdity?
Well, we can't take our institutions for granted. We should, of course, state this, but I think we need some context, Ralph. I mean, the United States Senate is not a place like, say, the legislature in Taiwan where you see fistfights, or the Parliament in Australia. I mean, I remember, traveling to Australia many years ago, flipping on the TV and seeing a legislator give the finger to another one on live TV. This is not happening in the United States. There is some element of decorum here. So it's I think our foibles are magnified because we are the world's largest economy and most powerful country militarily, and so there's just more focus on us than there is on other places. In terms of the seriousness, though, of our legislators, I would note, for instance, the effort in the House with the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party has done wonderful bipartisan work, important work on exposing the various vulnerabilities that we have and trying to come up with solutions. I'd point to the Senate and Senator Roger Wicker, who just came out with a real clarion call for upgrades to our military, again, pointing out some serious vulnerabilities that he would like to fix should he become chair of Armed Services. So there are very serious people, and John Fetterman's a Democrat, and he's stood up and supported Israel against many of his party and his party's leanings. So credit to him for doing so. There are great differences in the types of people who run for Senate versus Congress. That's for sure. The Senate is meant to be a deliberative body, but you mentioned American dynamism. American dynamism didn't happen because of anything that goes on in Washington. It happens because of our entrepreneurs and our innovators and our small business people. It happens because you can own mineral rights in Texas, tap natural gas and become a billionaire. Whereas you can't do that in places like Australia, where the government retains the rights. You don't have an Elon Musk staying in South Africa. Why not? Because he couldn't create the businesses that he can create here. You don't see people, clamoring to get into China. You see them, desperate to get out. They want to come here. And that tells you a lot. You have to look to where people, capital are going. And that tells you a lot about the vibrancy of nations, their rule of law, their general tolerance, the strength of their institutions. Just look at the people and look at where the money's going.
Since you mentioned China, like this is another issue I'd like to hear your opinion on. So I know a common friend of ours, Tony Nash, she seems to be, he's always very critical of the Chinese government and does not necessarily believe that they have a long-term strategic plan. Elbridge Colby, somebody who is actually warning that we potentially underestimate what the Chinese are capable of. So I was wondering, where would you kind of place current Chinese-US relations? Are we too sanguine about it? Or do you think that also, of course, given the domestic problems that China has as well, so the focus is very often on the United States because it's more transparent. So it's easier to see if there's a problem, whereas countries like Russia and China are simply not transparent. So it's very hard to tell what's going on internally. But do you think in this kind of competition that maybe the United States have to catch up in certain areas, and that maybe the idea that kind of peace through engagement and globalization and trade relations, that maybe we were too optimistic of hoping that this would prevent any kind of potential conflict in the future?
Well, there's a lot to your many questions in there, Ralph, and I'll try to address as many of them as they can. And I will also respectfully take issue with my friends Bridge and Tony, who I know very well. I am a bit of a Forrest Gump on China. I would not term myself a China expert. I'm not a Mandarin speaker, although I've studied it. So please don't think of me that way. I'm just someone who has had an enormous amount of practical experience in and around China in different capacities. So I observed it as editorial page editor for Asia for the Journal out of Hong Kong. When mainland China, they would just refuse to give me visas, unlike the news reporters who could kind of, at least be based in Beijing. I was not allowed to be based in Beijing. They thought we were too dangerous because we had opinions about communism. So I observed it mostly from Hong Kong. And then, of course, I played a very major role in the reorientation of the U.S. stance toward communist China when I worked at State. I introduced the secretary to many people, including Jimmy Lai. I wrote most of the statements on China that came up through the bureaucracy, which were very weak. Kelly Curry and I and others, Miles Yu, made sure that the effort to get China designated as crimes against humanity and genocide against the Uyghurs, we made sure that made it up into the secretary for that decision. So, there were many things that were done vis-a-vis China during that time. I think the Trump era was a key pivot, actually the real pivot, because we recognized that we were in a post-9/11 era, that we still faced threats from nation states, and that China was the preeminent threat among nation states. Although I do think that we downplay the threat from Russia, and we shouldn't, but that's for another conversation. And I think one of the key achievements of that administration was to wake up America and to the world to the nature of the communist regime and the breadth and the depth of threats that they pose to us, not just to the Chinese people or to our interests in Asia, but to us here in the United States. I referenced the balloon that floated over North America last year. That also woke a lot of people up, as did COVID, really. I mean, COVID obviously is not something we ever wished for, but I do think that just the way that Xi Jinping and the regime reacted, we offered help immediately, for instance. I don't think that's very well known. We offered to send our epidemiologists and doctors over. They refused. They covered up. They allowed it to spread. They locked down for 3 years. That woke up the business community that was relying on China for many supplies. So, pardon me, I think it is certainly bipartisan agreement now on Capitol Hill and even in corporate America. I talk to a lot of boards and CEOs of companies large and small. They get it. Now, you referenced the U.S.-China relationship. I don't think this is the correct framing. What we really are seeing now is a transition to a world where we have a U.S.-led free world bloc versus a China-led bloc which is opposed to our interests. And you also said the word competition. I think that this word is entirely inaccurate, and we in the Trump administration were guilty of using it, and the Biden administration adopted it, and I think it's nonsense. A competition implies a free acknowledgement and respect for common rules of engagement. China doesn't do that. It's not a competition. They're our adversary. But at the end of the day, the United States is a democracy, and it takes us a while to come to a bipartisan consensus when we face an enemy. And oftentimes it takes a terrible event like 9/11, a shock to us, Pearl Harbor, for us to wake up and say, oh gosh, they hate us, they want to kill us, or they want to dominate us. And we're just not there yet in the United States. We're getting there, but we're not quite there yet. Now, you mentioned my friend Bridge, who wrote a very interesting book on, as you say, focusing on China, arguing that we need a policy of containment. In many respects, it's a defensive argument. I don't think that's adequate. I think, in fact, it misunderstands the aspirations of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that what we need to do is take a more Reagan-esque approach, which is to speak over the regime to the people of China to say, we hope you enjoy the freedoms that we all enjoy in the West. Look at how great Chinese Americans are doing, or Chinese Canadians, or Chinese Brits, or what have you. The people, the Chinese in Malaysia, for instance, in your own region, or in Singapore, or Taiwan, the ultimate expression, right, of what mainland China could be were it free. And we ought to aspire to that, because there is no world in which a Marxist-Leninist party is going to simply sit and be satisfied with the lot that they have. They are by nature paranoid and expansionist. And so we need to recognize that reality and treat them that way. I'm not in any way suggesting a George W. Bush-like campaign for democracy. Do not get me wrong. I am not. I think Bridge and others are very prudent in their view that we need to expand alliances. America can't face this threat alone. It's just we can't. And that's why under Secretary Pompeo, we worked hard to expand and revivify the Quad, which was the U.S., Australia, India, and Japan. We worked hard to use our allies to help us push back against Chinese encroachment on international institutions like the UN. But I suppose I'm trying to answer all of your questions, Ralph, in one answer.
No, that's great. No, that's great.
If you want to distill it into just a couple messages, I think it's, don't frame it as a U.S.-China competition. It's wrong bilaterally, and competition is the wrong word. And don't think that you can just contain in any way this problem, because it's not just a China problem. It's a China, Russia, Iran, North Korea problem. And we need to see the world as it is. So I'm not saying that Republican approaches of the past can work. This is a different era. I don't think quoting Reagan works. It's not 1982. We have different threats, different problems. We have problems here on the continent. I think we're threatened here in the United States in ways that we never have been before, and so are you in Europe. So we need a new framing. I think we need a forward-thinking and offensive strategy that hasn't really been articulated yet, but needs to be.
No, I think these are great points, and I'm actually glad that you took the time to answer it so thoroughly. And it reminded me, you mentioned a Chinese-led bloc. I think it was David Frum who shortly after 9/11 said he kind of coined this term about the axis of evil. I don't want to, it would be a huge disappointment to our viewers and listeners. I think it was North Korea, Iraq, and I'm not sure if it was
Russia, China.
Iran. Yeah, exactly.
North Korea.
But back then, kind of that axis was a rhetorical device, but it didn't really exist. But I think now it really exists. Like now we know they're actually.
I think it existed all along.
All right.
And certainly, if you talk to our intelligence community professionals, they've been awake to these threats for decades. If you talk to defense industry professionals, they would tell you the same thing. This isn't new. What's new is that you had a U.S. presidential administration wake up and educate the American people about what those communities were seeing. And it's not a partisan issue. The threat from communist China, the threat from Putin's Russia is real. It doesn't in any way distinguish between Republicans and Democrats in the United States or Laborites and Tories in the UK. They don't care. This is a paranoid regime, nuclear armed, 400 weapons, world's largest navy, world's third largest air force, biological chemical weapons programs, who attack our satellites every day, cut our cables under the sea, who have no ethics in terms of their biological and chemical weapons research. These are the things that we need to be talking about. These are the threats. And it's, again, I'm not exaggerating. I'm quoting stats that are publicly available. They're published by the US government. This is the conversation that we need to have. So we need to stop talking about TikTok and let's start talking about this military buildup. I mean, I tell our clients, look at three things. Look at what they're building. Look at how they've used it as they've built it. They've only become more aggressive. And look at what Xi Jinping is saying about how they want to use these capabilities in the future. And let's believe him. That's just factual. All three of those things are factual. That's the discussion that we've started to have in the United States, but it's the discussion that Europe needs to have as well in a really meaningful way. And I think it's tough to do that when you've got a war not so far away on the continent of Europe and Ukraine and a second one in the Middle East. And that's the danger, is that we're reactive and we ignore these emerging threats and we don't work in concert together and work quickly. One more thing I'll say, Ralph. Sorry, I'm being so verbose, but
no, that's fantastic.
When it came to the Cold War, recall that it took Washington decades to hash through the right approach to deal with the Soviet threat. I mean, we had very strong responses. Eisenhower, Kennedy tried a certain kind of negotiation and failed, and we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then you had détente under Nixon and Carter, and that didn't work. And then you finally had Reagan, who took a hard line. Well, that's 4 or 5 decades of really arguing about it, debating, trying to figure it out. Presidential candidates running on different approaches. My fear is that we don't have that time today to figure it out through the normal democratic process that we go through. We just don't have time. There's an urgency here, and we need political leadership, right? Not just to wake people up, but to construct the kind of cooperative agreements and to help U.S. businesses and European businesses restructure to prepare for this world that we're very quickly entering, because it's very dangerous, not just militarily, but economically. And it's a world that none of us have experienced before. It's all new.
Do you think it would be fair to say that in addition of kind of this lack of urgency, that maybe over the last, that maybe this was the peace dividend, and that a kind of a certain comfort set in, let's put it this way, that now there's a little bit, at least in certain areas, a lack of a strategy. To use one example, it feels that in the 1970s, the United States, in hindsight, I believe, which was a diplomatic masterstroke, kind of broke China out of the communist alliance. I mean, one could say they more or less then also built up their new competition, but I think at the time that was the right move. It's unfair to say, oh, what you did in the 70s now has consequences in 2024. I think at the time this was a brilliant strategy pursued by Nixon and Kissinger. But do you think that maybe over the last couple of years, kind of we forgot to make sure, not just to, or let's say, we might strengthen our own alliances, but we did not enough to prevent a counter alliance to form. So there was not enough done kind of to try to keep maybe Russia out of China's influence. And also in the Middle East, it sometimes strikes me that Saudi Arabia, at least in my perception, I can be wrong, that they would be at least a political class. The public in Saudi Arabia might be something different, but they would be much more willing to have a closer relationship with the West, maybe even including the recognition of Israel, that it's sometimes us who pushes them away or ignores them. So there is no broad, it seems at least for the layman's eyes, that there is no great grand strategy that is pursued by the United States, but of course also by Europe. Europe is even worse, I would say. I think we really live day to day without any sense of what a great strategy, a grand strategy would look like.
Well, I think we're seeing U.S. foreign policy run by people who think they do have a grand strategy, who have PhDs and degrees from fancy universities, and you see the result. They don't really understand the hard realities of power politics, and they don't understand why U.S. deterrence matters. And you see this kind of graduate school approach where, if we say that we declassify some evidence that we think Putin's going to invade Ukraine, I get some kind of credit for that instead of taking action to prevent him from doing so, right? You see how they bungled the exit from Afghanistan. You're right. There is no strategy. If there's a strategy, it's one where we are deterred, and that's why the world is becoming so dangerous because enemy states aren't afraid of us anymore. And that's why you see Iran invading Israel and China taking really aggressive action, not just toward us, but Australian airplanes and Filipino boats, and somebody's going to die, and we're going to be in a crisis because of these emboldened actors. So, I think you're correct to say that President Nixon did what he felt was correct at the time. I should disclose that I was a member of the Nixon seminar and hosted it actually for several years. We just wrapped
I didn't know that. Yeah.
the final seminar actually last week at the Nixon Library, which is a wonderful place. And I would encourage all of your viewers and listeners, if you're ever in Orange County, California, you must go to the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda. It is absolutely a fantastic, fantastic place. And they do a lot of innovative programming and exhibits that now actually tour. They're so good. So it's probably the most active presidential library in the nation. But in any event, in the course of this seminar, it was chaired by Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien, and our honorary chairman was the late Henry Kissinger. We talked a lot about Nixon's views on China, and that was just as much about ending the war in Vietnam as it was an outreach to Beijing. And recall, too, that China and the Soviet Union had a split because the Chinese communists, viewed the Russians as overbearing. They didn't. After 1989, they saw it as a complete failure, which obviously it was, and they didn't want to be anything like the Soviet form of communism. Just look at what China does. They're not trying to create little mini communist Chinas like the Soviets did. They're very happy to just corrupt neighboring countries so long as they come under Beijing's thumb. It's a totally different approach. But that's neither here nor there. Nixon, later in his life, lamented that he had created a Frankenstein by opening up to China. And Kissinger himself, of course, made a fortune off of serving as a middleman and papering over the worst brutalities of the communist regime and encouraging U.S. businesses to go over there and not speaking forthrightly about the nature of the regime. Because frankly, Ralph, I'm not sure he understood it. He wasn't a scholar of China in any way, shape, or form. When he went over to Beijing, he was flattered. They brought him into the Great Hall. There was much pomp and circumstance. I think he was snookered, frankly. And I think history will be rewritten in that way. Of course, he's a great historian, a great scholar. I don't mean to demean him in any way, but I do think that the communists got the upper hand with him, and then he was enriched. And we need to acknowledge that part of the history. But Nixon also had another very interesting post-presidential observation when the Soviet Union fell. He spent time going over to Moscow, talking to Russians, and trying to warn American political elites that democracy in Russia had to succeed, because if it didn't, it would send a signal to communist China that they were on the right path. And it would not give any encouragement to the Chinese people to demand their freedoms. And he was right about that too. And I think if you go back and you read Nixon's books, he wrote many books, very eloquent, thoughtful man, really an intellectual, and you listen to his interviews, you will see just how right he was about the dangers of a Putin-like Russia and a communist China that was enriched by us and not challenged in any way on its way of life. I mean, we talk about China as having a quote-unquote government. It doesn't. It has a party. It's a thuggish party. It enriches itself and oppresses the many. It enriches a few and oppresses the many. It's an absolutely brutal, terrible regime, and we should speak of it in those terms.
No, I completely agree. And I think particularly what you mentioned about Richard Nixon, I think particularly as a thinker, he's much underappreciated and underrated. It's a tragedy that he's not more widely read, precisely for what you just said, right? Everybody just talks about Watergate, but I think there's much more to Richard Nixon than this Admittedly, of course, very interesting episode, but there is more that he should be remembered for. And I think it gives us a perfect leeway into my final question, where I'm mostly curious about your personal opinion. What do you make of what's currently happening? Sounds like a completely different topic, but I think it's related to this nonetheless. What's currently going on at US college campuses, kind of in US higher education? Sometimes this strikes me as maybe threat is an overused word, but that is in, and you mentioned this also before, I think in the very institutions that socialize, that marinate, that educate, then the people that are supposed to formulate policy, both economic policy, foreign policy, that shape the institutions, that create regulations, that sometimes it seems that these institutions instill, let's say, problematic beliefs, if you will, in young people, in college graduates. And I wonder if you have if this is something that doesn't cross your mind at all in a thorough fashion, or what your thoughts on that would be, and if you would be willing to share them.
Yeah, I'm happy to share them. In fact, I just skipped my 25th reunion at Harvard because I'm so appalled at how the administration has handled the many anti-Semitic incidents and even attacks on Jews on campus. There have been no resignations on the Board of Overseers, or other than the president, but she was really just part of the problem. There's been no real change there, and I think it's appalling. And it's not just a problem in the United States, Ralph. It's a problem in the UK. It's a problem in Australia and Canada and elsewhere. I think that's also important to acknowledge. I'll speak just to the United States, which I know best. For many decades, we've had a system of tenure in the United States. And it's almost like the Foreign Service of the State Department. It's a clubby enterprise with a guaranteed job, and they tend to select people like them. And since the 60s, universities have moved to the political left, and so they teach what they believe. And the trustees of these universities, who aren't often talked about, but they're like boards of directors of companies, have really dropped the ball. And they have allowed that political agenda to trump the teaching of really critical thinking, which is what universities should be teaching, how to think, not what to think, and to encourage students to, expand their horizons in all different manners, and to encourage a diversity of ideas, not just a diversity of skin color, which we thought we had gotten away from here in America, but apparently not. It's a disturbing development. I'm glad it's been exposed. We're nowhere near solving it. But you mentioned, foreign policy thinkers, quote unquote. I'm not sure who's supposed to be the foreign policy thinkers. I am very.
The two of us, for example.
Well, is that true? I mean, I think that there's been a how should I say it? A professionalization of whether it's foreign policy thinking or domestic policy thinking. People who sit in Washington for their whole careers, who never have a job in the real economy, who never start a business, who never serve in the military, are they more qualified than the people who are out there, employing others or having to deal with supply chain issues? Or, we're starting a building materials company. I just started on a new board. We're going to go out and we'll have to reckon with a lot of foreign policy. Where do we want to invest? Are there, where are we going to get our supplies from? How do we, vet people? How do we ensure we comply with Know Your Customer laws? I mean, I think one of the reasons why President Trump was so successful in containing Iran through the maximum pressure campaign, in forging really landmark peace accords across the Middle East, in, as I said earlier, waking up America and the world to the threat from communist China, is that he wasn't a foreign policy, quote unquote, expert. He was somebody who was versed in the realities of the real world and who had spent his career negotiating and trying to build a brand and build a business, and it allowed him to think differently and creatively. And, foreign policy is not something that mirrors exactly what's written in books. In fact, it often turns on personal relationships between national leaders. We don't like to talk about that, but it's true. I saw this firsthand traveling with the secretary all over the world. There were some people that he really meshed with and some that he didn't. And it was hard to get business done with those that he didn't. Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, we need creative thinking to deal with these very new threats that we face, whether it's from AI equipped drones or cyber threats from Russia or new biological and chemical weapons threats from China. I mean, the threats to our supply chain. I mean, there are all kinds of challenges that we're going to face, not just in the United States, but in the free world, including where you sit, Ralph. And we need people who, A, have courage, who are who are honest, who are going to speak truthfully to the public about the threats that we face, and three, who are creative in their thinking, who, if something hasn't worked, like a two-state solution in Israel, that hasn't worked for decades because the Palestinians don't want a two-state solution, don't want peace with Israel, then maybe you should stop trying and you should try something else. That's the kind of leadership. And you have to understand that you're not going to be liked, and that's okay. That's why I think we need more people who don't sit their whole careers in Washington at think tanks, right? We need people who have had a variety of life experiences, like Herbert Hoover, like Nixon, like, for instance, Kennedy, who have seen the world, understand its realities, have thought about it, understand why they believe what they believe, and do the right thing for the free world, regardless of whether or not it gets them reelected. And I think it's that demeanor that Trump has, plus his track record, and that's why I think he's leading in the polls. And that's, again, just to harken back to kind of where he started, that's why I think it's his election to lose.
Right. On that note, I already kept you 20 minutes longer than originally anticipated, but I have no regrets about it. I have to end our conversation, which I hope was just the first of many more to come. Mary Kissel, thank you so much for joining us on Brussels Horizon.
Pleasure to be with you, Rob.